Ben, please meet Christopher Bollyn.
Thank you. Thank you, Ron. Ron, should we turn down these front lights here? Ron, should we turn down the front lights?
Yes. These lights are all lit up.
Yeah, well, I got the sun. The sun's on me now, so you can turn them down because the sun is on me, so that's good. We started at the right time. Yeah, huh? So I'll be doing this presentation tomorrow in Austin as well. So this will be about a presentation about an hour, and we can have questions afterwards. It's Solving 9/11 Ends the War, or also known as Making Sense of the War on Terror. What I mean to say by that is the solution to the war on terror is 9/11 truth. When you understand that 9/11 is a giant hoax, a fraud, a false flag terror attack, then you can begin to make sense of everything we're going through. And I saw this Time magazine the other day at the airport. This is a recent Time magazine, October 16th. It's got the names of a bunch of places where we've had terrorist shootings in the United States, and it says, America's Nightmare. And people might ask, when does America's nightmare end with the terrorism and the war? Well, it ends when you solve 9/11, when you understand 9/11. So this is me at the Academy Awards a couple years ago. I have a one-man protest for 9/11 truth at the Oscars. Okay. And my background is I was an investigative journalist in Washington, D.C. when 9/11 happened. I have a degree in history from the University of California. My specialty is Israel and Palestine. And I'm the author of the Solving 9/11 set of books. And I grew up in Illinois, outside Chicago, where I was an Eagle Scout and a recipient of the God and Country Award. I'm presenting evidence here at the Citizens Grand Jury in Los Angeles in 2004. The Solving 9/11 set of books, this is the little book, The Deception That Changed the World. This is my analysis and investigation. And the Solving 9/11 books are unique in the 9/11 literature in that I look at the crime as an unsolved crime, who was behind the crime, and why it was done. This is the larger book, the original articles. This has all my articles about 9/11 written over an 11-year period from 2001 to May of 2012. My latest book, which I have here tonight, is The War on Terror, The Plot to Rule the Middle East. And this is the explanation of the connection between 9/11 and the War on Terror. And the War on Terror is actually, there's a strategic plan behind the War on Terror, which we are not told, which is why it doesn't make sense to us. But when you understand the plan behind the war, and it's not an American plan, then you make sense of what's going on in the Middle East. And recognizing that both 9/11 and the War on Terror have a common origin. They both originated in Israel, and they were conceived by Israeli military intelligence in the 1970s, in the late 1970s, when Menachem Begin, the notorious terrorist, when his party took power in Israel. So 9/11 was a false flag terror atrocity that was meant to create fear and rage in the American population to get the American people to support the war on terror. And this is the main reason why the American people are so ambivalent or non-critical of the war on terror, because they think that the war on terror is a good thing, when in fact it is nothing good about it at all. It's all based on deception. So starting the war on terror was the main reason for the false flag terror attacks of 9/11. 9/11 was a policy coup that brought us the war on terror. This photograph's from Iraq, and a series of costly wars. Now, in 2017, the problem is that our new president is embracing the same rhetoric, the same lie about 9/11. And he said, when he spoke on Afghanistan in August, he said, 9/11, the worst terrorist attack in our history, was planned and directed from Afghanistan. Then he says, because that country was ruled by a government that gave comfort and shelter to terrorists. That statement doesn't make a lot of sense. Because doesn't fit there. But the first part of the sentence does make complete sense. He's blaming Afghanistan and saying that the war has to go on in Afghanistan because 9/11 was coming from Afghanistan. That is the lie. There's no truth in that at all. This is Wesley Clark. He was the Supreme Allied Commander of the United States forces in Europe in the 1990s during the war in Yugoslavia. And he spoke in San Francisco in 2007. He said, "Whether you're a Democrat or Republican, if you're an American, you ought to be concerned about the strategy of the United States in this region. What is our aim? What is our purpose? Why are we there? Why are Americans dying in this region?" That is the issue. And that still is the issue 10 years later. He said, what happened on 9/11 is we didn't have a strategy. We didn't have bipartisan agreement. We didn't have American understanding of it. And we had a policy coup instead. A coup, a policy coup. He said some hard-nosed people took over the direction of American policy and they never bothered to inform the rest of us. But when he says that we didn't have American understanding of it, what he's saying is that the understanding that the military got of 9/11 came from a non-American actor. Who's he talking about? Did it come from France, Germany, England? He's talking about Israel. Israel interpreted 9/11 for us, and Israel told us what we should do. And this is Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. One day after 9/11, he said, we must build a coalition against terror today. It's time to take on the militant Islamic regimes with a great deal of strength. We should crush the terrorist infrastructure that threatens the entire free world. Now, if you look at all the operations that have gone on since 9/11, not one of them has the Israeli flag in it. But the Israelis are the ones who are masterminds of all of the operations, actually. Now, Netanyahu might speak English very well and look and sound like an American, but he is not pro-American. Here's one quote from 2005 that Netanyahu said. He says, once we squeeze all we can out of the United States, it can dry up and blow away. That gives you some idea of his attitude about the United States of America. So what was the plan that was put into effect by the Pentagon after 9/11 that led to the war on terror? It's the Zionist plan. These are the hard-nosed guys that hijacked American policy. This is the Zionist neocon troika of what's called the Defense Policy Board, who set the policies that we are now implementing in the Middle East. And it is, of course, Paul Wolfowitz, Assistant Deputy Secretary of Defense, Comptroller of the Pentagon, Dov Zakheim, the man who oversaw the Pentagon budget when $2.3 trillion was reported missing the day before 9/11. And over here, Douglas Feith, whose father was a member of the Irgun. The man they're conversing with here is the Chief of Staff of the Israeli military. His name is Shaul Mofaz. This was taken, a photograph at the Pentagon, what is that, 3 months after 9/11. And what were they talking about? What was the policy that these guys crafted? Well, Wesley Clark again, he said, about 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. One of the generals called me and he said, sir, we've made the decision, we're going to war with Iraq. We're going to war with Iraq, I said, why? I don't know, he said. I came back a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing Afghanistan. I said, are we still going to war with Iraq? He said, sir, it's worse than that. We're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off with Iran. And as you can tell from that shopping list, all of those countries have already been done, with the exception of Iran. The plan that is being put into effect, the plan that's being implemented is this. It's called the Yinon Plan, named after the man who wrote it, Oded Yinon, the Israeli strategist. And it was written in 1982 and published in an Israeli magazine, a Zionist magazine, in Hebrew. And then thanks to Israel Shahak, he translated, an Israeli scholar, he translated this work into English for the benefit of the Americans and the rest of the world. And it's Israel's master plan to dominate the Middle East. And what it calls for is basically breaking up the large Arab countries into ethnic statelets or enclaves. So like in the case of Iraq, there's the Kurdish area in the north, which has just voted for independence, the Sunni area in the west, and the Shiites in the south. Libya has already been broken up. Syria, they're trying to break Syria up. This is the name of the game. And these are the ethnic groups that they want to break, how they want to break the countries up. And the Oded plan, the Oded Yinon plan calls for the dissolution of Syria and Iraq is Israel's primary target on the Eastern Front. Primary target. The dissolution of the military power of these states serves as the primary short-term target. This is exactly what the United States has done in the last 10 years with Iraq and Syria. So you have to understand that there is no American interest at play or at stake in the Middle East, in these countries. We're doing the bidding of another nation. We are fulfilling the policy of another state, not ours. And this is the area, this periwinkle area, this is the Kurdish area. And what we've seen in the last couple of years is that with American help and Israeli help, these Kurds have increased their territory into Kirkuk, taken the oil-rich area, and what they've been doing in the last few years is they've been piping the oil from Kirkuk fields to Turkey, over here, and then the oil has been taken down to Israel and sold on to other countries, because it's basically stolen oil. And the oil that they're stealing is owned or has been taken by the Rothschild family, because the Rothschild family is the largest holder of the reserves of the Kurdistan area of Iraq. And if you looked at the news today, now the Iraqi forces from Iraq are now fighting and have retaken Kirkuk away from the Kurds. And the Kurds are trying to get the Americans now to come and fight this war. And just yesterday, the Americans said, the United States said, we're not going to get involved in this. But it's a long way from settled. That's a little bright, Ron. It's a little, okay. Okay. Now, the Kurdish area is, in north of Iraq, is controlled by this man, Masoud Barzani. And the Barzani family are very close to Israel. His father is Mustafa up here. He's meeting with the head of the Mossad in Kurdistan. Here's his Mustafa meeting with Moshe Dayan in Israel in 68. This is 66, this is 68. And this is his son. And this is today, or current times, this is the Kurdish flag, independence flag of Kurdistan, being flown next to the Israeli flag. Because the Israelis have been pushing and supporting the Kurds all along. It's part of the Israeli policy to support the non-Arab entities in the Middle East, to break up the Arab states. So when September 11th happened, the mass media gave us a very simple story. They had a prepared narrative, a story to give us. We were told that radical Islamic terrorists had done it, and this was the act of catastrophic terrorism that changed the United States of America. And as I was, I think maybe this Time magazine issue from last week shows all these shootings, all this nightmare that has happened to the United States just in terms of shootings. 4 of the 5 worst shootings have happened in the last 10 years. But we have to understand what is the source of the terrorism. The terrorism is not just crazy Americans going nuts and shooting up the places. All of this most of this stuff is artificial. It's being constructed carried out by elements of our own government and other governments, and we are the target. We are the target. Changing our perception is the whole reason. So the only way we can liberate ourselves and our nation from this nightmare, as Time magazine puts it, is to understand the real source of the terrorism. And 9/11 is the keystone to the whole thing. So on 9/11, the Bush administration declared it to be an act of war. That's very important. The reason why it's in quotation marks is because it's a legal term. And it meant that instead of investigating the 9/11 crime as a crime, they considered it an act of war and gave the president the authority to wage war against those countries that he thought were responsible. That's where we've been ever since. So you may have seen last week that a couple U.S. commandos were killed in a country called Niger, in the middle of Africa. And what were American forces doing in Niger? They're fighting the war on terrorism in Niger. But we've never been told anything about that. The deputy director of counterterrorism at the U.S. State Department, 1 week after 9/11, Larry Johnson, he said this over here. He talked about how these guys were, zealots. They were not part of the network in the sense they were not ones calling the shots. He went on to say, "We don't have anything in history to compare with this. The only thing that comes close to it is a former Soviet intelligence operation." And what he's implying here is that the 9/11 crime was very sophisticated, very well planned, required a state agency, a fixed frame of an intelligence organization. It required immense infiltration of the American computer systems, a complete domination and infiltration of the U.S. military, and things like that. It was not done by some students in Hamburg or Afghanistan or anywhere like that. A few points about the 9/11 crime. This is both planes went into secure computer rooms. They went into the floors or computer rooms where there were no people, only large banks of computers and large batteries to power those computer systems. This is the North Tower, 8:46 in the morning, and this plane went into the computer room of Marsh McLennan Company. It's interesting to note that this company was the employer of Jerry Bremer, the man who went on to control occupied Baghdad, occupied Iraq for the first 3 years, Jerry Bremer. This company also was responsible for security at the World Trade Center. The second plane, this is said to be Flight 175. It's not Flight 175. The bottom of the plane it looks like a 767 tanker with a groove here, and it has this odd piece of hardware attached to the bottom. And at 9:03, just before this plane struck the tower, it fired something from the bottom of the plane, which made a hole in the building that allowed the plane to enter the building. Here we see a good picture that the missile opened up a white-hot hole about the same size as the fuselage. And this obviously allowed the fuselage to enter the building because it was otherwise running into steel columns. And this indicates the heat of this circle, of this hole, indicates that this was probably a depleted uranium warhead. And here we see an explosion coming out the entry wound. This is not burning jet fuel. This is a massive explosion coming out, throwing things back. And here's the far side of the explosion. You see that a mighty explosion. Now, if that DU missile went through there at 6,000 degrees Celsius, the jet fuel and anything else combustible would have burned immediately. And so we see that most of the jet fuel on the plane combusted in the first few seconds of the crash. Here you can see this is the burning jet fuel. You see the sooty carbon residue here. This is an explosion coming out. And here we see the depleted uranium warhead coming out the far side with great momentum and another piece of the missile. Those are not part of the aircraft. You can see that one way you can tell is the color of the flame. It's burning white hot, and it's leaving behind dark oxides. And this is classic hallmarks of a depleted uranium warhead, which is commonly used in most American missiles these days. It's an armor-piercing weapon. And here's another photograph. So I had done depleted uranium research with a scientist at Livermore Lab in California, and I sent him these photographs, and I asked him, does this object have the characteristics of a DU warhead? And he said, yes, it does. So that explains, this was the spark, this was the igniter that set off this conflagration that we see. And then the tower fell in what was clearly an explosive demolition at 9:59, because that top part toppled. This is 30 stories high here. And as it toppled, it disintegrated in midair before it fell anywhere. And then we had these pyroclastic clouds. Pyroclastic clouds contain fire. And in this case, these clouds contained billions of tiny droplets of molten iron. They were very hot. And then at 5:20 in the afternoon, Building 7 fell down into its footprint at free fall speed. And the only thing with this building that was a problem was that it had some office fires in it that had been caused, we don't know by whom. But of course we know from Barry Jennings and people who were in this building that morning, there were tremendous explosions in this building as well. And here we have the box columns, the large box columns. There were 47 columns like this that held up the building, World Trade Center buildings. And here you see one that's been cut at a 45-degree angle. Looks like it's been a cutter charge applied there. Something happened to this one, may have been a cutter charge as well. There's a lot of slag here, and it's been cut. And all of those box columns would have to be cut at the same time for the building to fall. So this guy, Professor Jones, out in Utah, he contacted me in 2005, wanted to know what I knew about molten iron, molten metals found at the World Trade Center. So I sent him all the information that I had, and then I went out and saw him in early March of 2006 here in Utah. And he was of the opinion that there was a lot of thermite involved in the destruction of the World Trade Center. Go around. No, go around. Go around. Go around. And what we see here is a thermetic reaction occurring on the 81st floor. This is 7 minutes before the building fell. And the thermite reaction produces white smoke, which is here, aluminum oxide. It produces a great deal of heat, 2,500 degrees Celsius above, and it creates molten metal. So this is an AP photograph at 9:52:51. Exactly 1 minute later, we have this image from WABC TV, shows molten iron pouring off the building in large quantity, because those windows are 2 feet wide there, and when you consider that this is falling for 7 minutes, you're talking about tens of tons of stuff, because 1 cubic yard of molten iron weighs something like 6.5 tons. So this went on for 7 minutes before the building fell. What's important to understand here is that this has not been discussed, besides being on WABC TV on 9/11, it has not ever been discussed by the mainstream media, because just this molten metal by itself disproves the official myth. There's nothing in the official story that can account for molten iron being produced, or any other molten metal. And as they began removing the rubble from the pile, they found that beneath the pile were these extremely hot pieces of metal. There were hot spots that when the metal was dripping, you see it's white hot, it's light yellow, and then below that it's dripping, it's melting. And the firefighters, they witnessed it. They said, molten metal? You get down below and see molten steel running down the channel rails like you're in a foundry, like lava, like a volcano. And I called up the American contractor who removed the rubble. There was only 1 out of the 4 were American. And he told me that he had seen pools of literally molten steel at the base of the 3 towers. And that is 6 basement levels down at the bedrock of Manhattan. And it was where the elevators came down. And I contacted another contractor who was overseeing the entire thing. His name was Loiseau in Maryland, and he confirmed that. And I asked him, how can you explain the presence of molten iron or molten steel at the base of the elevators in all 3 towers? And he said, well, you have to consider all the paper that fell down the elevator shafts. As if burning paper, can melt steel. But this is the kind of nonsensical responses that I've gotten for years when I was investigating this crime, because lies, they say in German, lies have short legs. And that's the fact. Lies can't go anywhere because they're simply not true. Now, billions of tiny balls of iron like this were created during the demolition. But again, burning jet fuel cannot produce molten iron, which requires temperatures above 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. But superthermite does. And these are, as I said, this is a micrograph. This is a photograph taken under a microscope. Both of these are. And you see there's a whole bunch of little droplets, little balls of iron. And these balls typically they're called iron-rich because they're mainly iron, but they also have a little bit of aluminum in them. So the official reports document the molten iron. This comes from an official report, but they don't explain what caused it, because they can't. And the mainstream media has avoided it because they don't want to even broach the subject, because they can't explain the obvious question, what caused it? So they don't go there. And that's the fault, that's the failing of American media today. Today the media is all basically owned by 6 companies in this country. It's consolidated like it was in Soviet Union, worse. And the worst thing about it is that American people think it's a free press. and it's not. And here they found molybdenum spheres, these little spheres of molybdenum. And this is another problem because this requires even a hotter temperature than iron. And this sphere was probably formed in a thermetic reaction of aluminum and molybdenum trioxide. It's another form of superthermite. Now, this is from the Department of Defense Energetics Center. And this shows you that these thermites, these top 4 things are thermite. The first one is molybdenum trioxide and aluminum. That's something that would have created molten molybdenum. The bottom 4 are explosives. And all it's showing you is that these oxidizers, these aluminothermic reactions, they have higher energy density than explosives. So that means that you have more energy, more bang for the buck. And they go on to say here, potential exists to increase kinetics by size reduction. What they're saying is that you can increase the power and the speed of the reaction when you make the particles smaller. That's nanotechnology. Nanotechnology takes the same things, reduces them to nano size, and mixes them in a matrix form and creates a super powerful explosive. That's why they call it superthermite. And that's what they found in the World Trade Center dust. They found these little chips. Professor Jones and his team, they found these chips looked like primer, paint, they thought. But when they heated it up to 430 degrees Celsius, it went bang and created a little tiny ball of molten iron and aluminum. This is called superthermite. And this is what it looked like up close. It had bilayered, one red layer and a gray layer. And this gray layer or silver layer has led me to think that this may have been a foil, like aluminum foil. One side's red, one side's... And there was a woman that worked in the World Trade Center building number 7, and her son came to one of my presentations, and he said his mom always took the stairs for exercise going down building 7. And she was going down the stairs a few weeks before 9/11, and these guys were wrapping a foil around the pipes in the stairwell. And she asked them, why are you doing that? And they said, the pipes are sweating too much. So I thought that this may be an example of something like that, because when you make nano composites, things like that, they're often, for computer industry, they're made in foils. They're made as a foil. Well, whatever it was, it created super, super, super hot spots under the pile. And if you recall, the so-called fires were not put out until Christmas of 2001. Christmas. And so all these guys that worked on the pile were exposed to the smoke that rose through the pile. And we now know that this smoke contained huge amounts of nanoparticles, again, the nano word, but which made it extremely toxic, which gives the lie to the EPA, Christy Todd Whitman, who said that air is safe to breathe. The air in New York around this incinerator pile was anything but safe to breathe. So of these firefighters in New York that were on the pile, 1,600 at least have already died of cancer. That number is several months old. And there are 5,700 more who are dying of cancer. So it's a big public health issue in New York City. And Dr. Thomas Cahill at UC Davis, who tested the smoke, had a device to test the smoke, said it was like they were working inside the stack of an incinerator. Now, this is the smoke as it rose, and being an aerosol expert, he just got one glimpse of this smoke and the color of the smoke and said, that smoke is dangerous, because that's like car exhaust, but the bluish color tells you the size of the particles. And you can tell right away that smoke contains a lot of nanoparticles. Now, nanoparticles are extremely toxic to humans, to anybody, for one reason, and that's the size. They're so small that they will not be stopped in your lungs or your throat. They're so small, they will permeate every membrane in the body until they reach the nucleus of the human cell, and they'll lodge in the nucleus. And that's where they cause havoc for the human system. Now, okay, so you've seen that we had these extreme hot spots. We had molten iron, molten steel pouring off the building. The media hasn't talked about it. The government hasn't talked about it. It's been 16 years now. So if the government and media are lying to us about 9/11, it means that they are controlled by the same